Alright, the proposition I'm refuting today is that deforestation negatively affects Earth's environments. The three secondary claims he uses are deforestation endangers and injures wildlife, it damages the atmosphere, and that it permanently damages biomes. His first secondary claim is deforestation endangers and injures wildlife, and he talks about how animals lose their homes. And he goes on to talk about how, as well, that birds have shorter wings in areas that are, when they're living in the areas of deforested areas. The first questions that come to mind is that if animals lose their home because of deforestation, one, how are the birds living in these deforested areas? And what does this even have to do with deforestation? And also, the advocate says that this reduces adaptive diversity, but wouldn't the birds having shorter wings in these certain areas be considered adaptivity? And who are we to say that this is a bad thing? If you take the example of the peppered moth, is a moth that changed to a black and white color due to soot being all over soot and ash being all over the trees, and they were the only moths that actually survived when the birds came and eat them, because all the other ones did not blend in as well. He also goes to talk about that they cut down available resources, and my evidence challenge here is that the advocate talks about how deforestation causes severe famine in the Horn of Africa, when really, according to All Africa on August 6, 2013, it was reported that the famine was actually due to three causes, which was drought caused by weather, high food costs, and poverty / violent political instability. So now we're under the assumption that his evidence here is false. His next secondary claim is that deforestation causes atmospheric damage. He talks about how it has a larger buildup in CO2 when you cut down forests, and this may be true. My counterclaim is that the advocate only talks about how the CO2 rises only cause surface warming, also known as global warming. But when listening to Dr. Mark Henderson, he tells us that when looking at a long stretch of time, warming actually happens before CO2 rising, and it goes cause-effect, not effect-cause, so obviously that proves that it's kind of a hoax. And also, in looking at a chart given to us by John Englander, it shows that global warming has gone up and down for about the past 400,000 years, over and over, not just increasing. It just happens kind of like a pattern. And that the CO2 rising, my advocate talks about, has nothing to do with the warming then. Also, the advocate talks about fossil fuels emissions being rising, which actually has nothing to do with deforestation, once again, bringing up something that doesn't matter. And I decided just to look it up, and that according to S.M. Ensler from Lentech, fossil fuels is actually very beneficial, and we use it as a great source of energy. My advocate's third secondary claim is that deforestation permanently damages biomes. He talks about how rainforests cannot be replaced and it's impossible. My counterclaim is that, as Boyce Thompson from the Institute of Plant Research tells us, a study was done in Costa Rica where researchers successfully replanted a rainforest that was desolate for 50 years just by planting seeds from the local community. My advocate states that deforestation has great contribution to disasters and uses floods as an example. And he just tells us that there was floods, and he uses this example from an environmental protection group, so it's kind of a little bit biased that the environmental protection group is talking about something that would protect the environment. And he doesn't actually give it a legit example about the floods, he just talks about there being floods in forests. Next, he talks about how deforestation drastically changes rainfalls, and says that if trees are cut down, less water can be evaporated. The same would go for if the tree just fell down by natural causes. Then lastly, he states that deforestation is around the world, and this may be true, but honestly it's just a statement, just like basically saying that humans breathe oxygen, just a flat out statement. So from all the false evidence that my advocate provided, and through all the reasoning and evidence challenges I provided, the proposition you can see is false. Thank you.
All right, structurally, you start off pretty well. You've got an interesting set of conundrums that you present on the advocate's first example dealing with the wildlife in the area, and you talk about the birds. I think that you asked a couple of interesting questions and pointed out some inconsistencies there. I think there's another good question about why the bird life is the key factor to evaluate when we're talking about the risk to the environment there. The example of the peppered moth is an interesting one. You do want to give us a source citation on that, and it's a demonstration, for instance, that adaptivity is alive and well. I like that idea. So I guess the argument here is that in the long run, it diminishes the claim, suggesting that you're not likely to wipe it out, but rather it's just going to be transformative what's going on in the area. That needs to be a little bit clearer. On the issue on resources, I thought your argument about the famine was pretty nicely put. You had a piece of evidence that suggested that there's really a combination of factors that attempts to explain this, and so there are other causalities that you're dealing with here. I think that's fine. That doesn't make the advocate's evidence false, but it does make their conclusion unreliable. That's the way you want to present that issue. Not that they fabricated the evidence in some way, or even that their evidence doesn't lead to the conclusion that they're talking about, but the complete picture is one that is not visualized by the advocate. That's the way I think that argument needs to be presented. The CO2 argument, basically you kind of present a couple of general statements about the problem of worrying about CO2 and global warming, suggesting that this is a natural occurrence that happens regardless of whether or not we're foresting or deforesting, so we shouldn't be reacting to it too much. I guess that's an okay press. It's a very general argument. It would probably apply to a lot of issues that are going on. And you know what? Sometimes that's a good way to handle a general problem like this, is to attack the premise of the argument instead of attacking the advocate's specific evidence on that point. Let's go to the more general premise and see if there's something problematic with that. I didn't really understand the whole fossil fuel argument either, the way you presented the advocate's argument there, or your answer to it. It's just not particularly clear. You make an argument that says, it sounds like you're quoting somebody. It says, well, it's been beneficial, but that's all we get. How has it been beneficial? What the benefits are? How we weigh that? There's no explanation of that. So that's just general stuff that I don't think does you any good. There's no explanation about how it applies. On the rainforest replication, I thought that was an interesting point, suggesting that, in fact, if it were necessary, we could restore the rainforest. There's not really any argument about whether or not the rainforest is disappearing. You seem to be granting that. But the notion that it's a long-term or it's an irreversible process, that I think you've got an answer on here, and a pretty good example. I didn't really hear a source citation on it. I didn't know that the example took place in Costa Rica, but you want to give us a source on that. The flood example, I don't think it's biased because it's an environmental group. I think that that's misuse of the concept of bias. The bias might be if they were ignoring other information, if they were funded by some organization or institution that had a specialized agenda that benefited them in some way. I think that's similar to some of the weak presses that we heard before. I don't think that's the best approach to that. Your stronger argument is that it's not clear what the link is to deforestation and the flooding issue. I think that that's a little bit more valuable to you. And I thought you had a pretty good summary at the end of the speech. All right. Thank you.